So from a trauma theory perspective, how does the nervous system discharge and return to baseline? So in the last video, we talked about the polyvagal theory. What is the polyvagal system? What is the autonomic nervous system? How does that work? And then in the second video, we talked a little bit about what are trauma symptoms, what does that look like when a nervous system is dysregulated. So in this video, we'll talk about just a few high-level overviews or tools, how we can discharge energy from the nervous system and return to baseline. So we're up here in ventral vagal and we feel safe. We're driving down the road, we're in a car, we're like singing along to some tunes, life is great. And then the car in front of us slams on its brakes. And what happens is we immediately go from the ventral aspect of the nervous system to the sympathetic aspect of the nervous system. So we go from a place of resting and digesting to fight flight. I'm sure you guys have heard those terms. And the way that we get from the ventral aspect of the vagal complex to the sympathetic tonus, it happens in a fraction of a second, right? The car in front of us slams on its brakes, and in a few hundred milliseconds, we've gone through physiological arousal through the stress response. Our pupils dilate, our heart rate increases, digestion stops. Norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline are pumping through the system. There's blood sugar level changes. Blood rushes away from the skin so you don't bleed out if you get cut. And again, this all happens very, very quickly. We have mobilized a lot of internal resource to prepare us to fight or flight. We are now primed for an all-out fight or flight. So from a trauma theory perspective, we could discharge, so this is all mobilized. So from a trauma theory perspective, the way that we get from sympathetic tonus and back up here to baseline would happen through discharging this mobilized energy, all of the internal resources we've cultivated to avoid the car accident. And that could happen by slamming on your brake. Slamming on your brake is a protective impulse. So imagine slamming on the brake, discharging, right? And this is slamming on the brake would be considered all of these here, the fight and flight, those are both protective impulses. Those are ways that you want to protect yourself. Now, what would happen if we weren't able to avoid the car accident? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we slam on our brakes and it still occurs. Fighting is not going to work. That's like a 2-ton piece of metal streaming at you. And flighting is also not going to work. I'm not able to run faster than a car, and you're probably strapped in. You're trapped. So your system is stuck. Fighting and flighting doesn't work. So what we would then do is we would drop down a system and we would move to the next protective impulse that we have available to us. We would come down here to the dorsal aspect of the vagal system. And remember, we talked about this aspect, that this is brilliant, that this is involuntary, right? And we use it because it works. So the dorsal aspect, remember, this is when a lizard is crawling on a path and a predatorial bird goes overhead and the lizard freezes. I'm a leaf, you can't see me. And that worked. That freezing protected the lizard, which is why the lizard we wouldn't do something that didn't work evolutionarily. So from a dorsal perspective, this is when we're in freeze, collapse. This is when we are dissociated, feigned death, kind of shut down, numb, spacey, zoned out. So dissociation, imagine that an antelope is being dragged back to a lion's den because the mama lion is feeding her cubs. That would be agonizing. It's absolutely overwhelming for an antelope. That would be so much pain. And if the antelope dissociates, they don't have to feel the agony. We think about the child that's being abused, the soldier who's in war, the nurse in shock trauma. They talk about how they could see their bodies, but they didn't have to feel what was happening. So dissociation is actually a protective impulse. This is brilliant. This is nature's mercy. This is involuntary, right? So this is another way that we get to strip away the stigma and the shame. Whenever there's a rape victim, people are like, well, why didn't she do something? Remember that the body is going to do whatever it can to help us survive. So let's talk about the feigned death aspect. Imagine a possum playing possum, right? So that possum is playing dead. And I can imagine that no self-respecting possum actually wants to lay there playing dead while a fox is sniffing and smelling all around them. That's probably really stressful and terrifying for the possum. However, the possum has learned through evolution, this is a brilliant adaptive response, that it's more likely to survive if it doesn't run. It cannot outrun the fox, so it lays there. Because predators like foxes and wolves and bears, they have what's called a kill instinct, and they want to chase live meat, because if meat is dead, it could be spoiled. Inert meat could be spoiled and they could get sick. So they also have a brilliant evolutionary response that helps them survive. So if the possum plays dead, the fox might go away. Now, you can see YouTube videos where a possum wakes up from being asleep, effectively, from this feigned death experience, and it looks like he's shaking. But if you slow it down, he's actually running in still motion. Because the protective impulse, remember this is a protective impulse, the sympathetic tonus, was thwarted. He overrode the desire to run away in favor of something that might help him survive. And to discharge all of this mobilized energy, he runs. He completes the protective impulse, right? So remember that when we go from baseline to sympathetic tonus, we mobilize a lot of internal resource. The stress response, norepinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline. When we come down to sympathetic tonus, we have all of that mobilized energy and we're prepared for an all-out fight or flight. If the fight or flight works, we return to baseline. If the fight or flight doesn't work, all of that mobilized energy gets bound up. It gets bound up into the nervous system and we go into the dorsal vagal complex. To come out of the dorsal vagal aspect, what has to happen is we have to discharge all of that bound up energy to come back up here to baseline. So, for example, the possum runs in still motion. He completes the protective impulse of flighting. After 9/11, many less people had PTSD than after Katrina. After 9/11, people got to run away. They got to complete the protective impulse of running away, of reaching safety. So it's very, very interesting. And later in these videos, we will go through various things that you can do to discharge energy from the system and bring yourself back to a ventral vagal complex. But first, I'll give one more example. So here in this dorsal vagal, you're frozen, right? The thing that saved you, freezing, will later actually be the thing that torments you. For example, there's a lot of research and statistics around women who were sexually assaulted, and then 10 years later they kill the perpetrator. And these women are being tried for premeditated murder. But what's really going on is that they freeze, they go into this stuck place, and then when they thaw, when they start thawing out of this freeze place, all of the outrage and anger and terror that was bound up when they had the fight-flight response is still present in their system. It's actually been present for those 10 years. They were just numb, they were just shut down. And they erupt to try and protect themselves. So this is one of the things that happens that continues to re-traumatize us, right? We freeze, we start to thaw. It's overwhelming because we might hurt someone we love or act it out in ourselves. We don't understand why we're behaving the way we do, and so we refreeze. We start to thaw, it's overwhelming, we refreeze. And this is happening, again, involuntarily, and this system can really contribute to dysregulation in the nervous system and people being stuck in a trauma vortex or a trauma cycle. So again, in the show notes, we'll go ahead and put a link if you'd like to learn ways that you can discharge this bound up energy in the nervous system and get yourself back to baseline, to regulation. You can click there.